Once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will always have a live chat on the first Friday of the month at 8 p.m. So please subscribe, click on the bell, and let's get 1,000 subscribers very soon. Gudde Moien and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss the ASB scenario, what if Luxembourg became an empire. Luxembourg has a long history, and according to our national legend, it was founded by Sigfried. Sigfried, also known as Count of the Ardennes, got the rocky promontory known as Lucilinburhuc at that time, and also the surroundings of it. This was in exchange for land that he owned near Feulen. However, it is very clear that Luxembourg was populated already way before, and the name Lucilinburhuc had Roman origins. Since the Roman times there was a fortified tower which guarded the crossing of the two Roman roads which met at the site of Luxembourg city. Anyways, there is a lot of confusion between the city of Luxembourg, Luxembourg as county, as duchy, as grand duchy and dynasty. It is not always very clear, so bear with me. We will focus on the dynasty of Luxembourg, but also on Luxembourg as county, which later on will be transformed into the kingdom and then later on the empire. So after some time it will not matter whether the dynasty is still ruling Luxembourg or if someone else does. The dynasty I will be talking about is the one of Limburg-Luxembourg, because there were many dynasties that called themselves Luxembourg. Their dynasty had many competent rulers, and one of them was Henry VII. Despite the strong concurrence of the French king to become king of the Romans and being a vassal of the French, Henry VII won the election to become the king of the Romans, and it was thanks to the Archbishop of Trier, who at this time was his brother. There was already a good foundation set for an upcoming rule of the Luxembourgers. Nobody wanted to see an expansion of the French, and the main German candidate was very unpopular. Thus Henry VII somehow unexpectedly became king of the Romans, and in 1312 the Pope even crowned him personally as emperor, and this title had been vacant for over 50 years. Due to his competent political understanding, he managed to solve a crisis in Bohemia. He married his son John the Blind to the last daughter of the dying Czech dynasty, and he managed to keep the French somewhat in check. He even also almost managed to make an arrangement with Naples, but this agreement never came into existence because the ruler of Naples, he was too greedy. The son of Henry VII, John the Blind, or John of Bohemia, well, as the name says, he was blind. And we will use this as one of 2 points of divergences. In nutshell, he ordered the restoration of the Prague castle, and he went to the Battle of Crécy. So let's say John the Blind would not order the restoration of Prague, and thus the rulers of Luxembourg would continue to reside within Luxembourg city, and since John the Blind was blind, he would not participate in the Battle of Crécy, creating a less good relationship with the French, and it will allow a few things. The first thing is that a future alliance with the English would be set, because there is not this close relationship between the dynasty of Luxembourg and the rulers in France, and it will be very vital in the centuries to come. Also, the concentration of power within Luxembourg city instead of Prague is very important, as otherwise we will not have a Luxembourgish empire. John now lives longer and still continues his life, full of travels but not with so much fights. His son will learn more of his father, and this will ensure that his son Charles the Fourth will get more experience and even become more competent than in OTL. Thus a tradition would be established because John's father Henry did the same to him. Italy will now be more under the control of the emperor and probably still rebel, but with a continuation of stronger and more competent rulers. Emperors, this wouldn't pose any problem at all. It is possible that the conflict with the Wittelsbacher and the Emperor Louis IV would continue until John the Blind eventually becomes emperor, but where his son would effectively manage all. It would also set a foundation where the title would start to become hereditary, but without having it written anywhere yet. The main enemies next to the Habsburg dynasty would also be the Wittelsbach, and they could in the longer term seek to manage an alliance with some Italian lords or cities in the coming future, but I think that the Bavarians and the Austrians, they would somehow start to melt in some way or another. Instead of rebuilding Prague, he would rebuild Luxembourg City. Not in the sense that Luxembourg City was destroyed, but he would rebuild it to his own image, giving it a new town, a university, churches, and, very important, he was a sponsor of arts. And thus Luxembourg City will also become a city not only just of the leadership or the dynasty, but also of arts. One of his main goals would be to unite the lands of Bohemia with the lands of Luxembourg. But because the concentration of power is right now in that ATL in Luxembourg City, the county of Luxembourg would expand instead of the kingdom of Bohemia. And due to the fact that he also purchased Brandenburg, as it was very close from Bohemia, the borders of both entities would touch each other, as would some parts of Bohemia and Silesia. The eastern possessions would be a bit smaller, but still very considerate, of course, being much bigger than the ones in the west. The successor of Charles Wenceslaus would mark a small period of decline, and he would still not accept to be elected as emperor, while his brother Sigismund would accept it later on. At the same time, instead of giving Luxembourg to Jobst, Wenceslaus would give Bohemia to Jobst, and then he would, when he would die, Jobst would continue the rule over most of the Luxembourgish possessions, while Sigismund would become the king of Hungary without any territories in the HRE. And when Jobst would die, all of it would go to Sigismund later on. Sigismund in OTL focused on the east, but with Luxembourg and parts of the lowlands in his hands. He would also need to check the western possessions, but he wouldn't really care so much because he was very much focused and influenced by the Hungarians. It would alter some things, if not many things, in the east for a certain time, but the Ottoman expansion would still happen as it was inevitable. If Sigismund had more children, he would probably end up dividing his possessions, where the eldest would get all the parts of Luxembourg and the possessions of the HRE, while Hungary would be given to the second oldest, and with some chance he would be accepted by the Hungarian nobility. Fast forward, Luxembourg would not only be a county, but a duchy, and eventually become a kingdom. It might even become an elector, due to the fact that Luxembourg City was greatly built, and the children would be sent to Paris for educational purposes, as it was done way before, where for instance Henry or even John, they were sent to Paris to learn in the court of Paris. And now other rulers, they would start to send their kids to Luxembourg instead, giving it a much higher prestige. In the centuries to come, it would face battles with France, some devastating ones, that's for sure, and some that they could win. In the east, the alliance with Hungary would continue and be very essential to somehow have a good ally in the east who would just stop any other advances of enemies. Italy would be quiet and follow the lead of future Luxembourgish emperor, although with many rebellions. However, Italy, especially the north, would not become as divided as it was in our timeline, and even so, some cities would keep an independence, such as Venice or Genoa, but I think that these cities, they would have a similar status to the one of Nuremberg, for instance, however with a much bigger influence, not only in northern Italy but also in the trade routes, as these cities were very vital and very important for the trade, and I don't think that any Luxembourgish emperor would seek to destroy this influence, as at the end it would also be very beneficial for the HRE. And with similar tactics as in the east, Luxembourg would eventually get all of the lowlands except for the lands that were owned by the bishops, and they would start to expand on the coast. So, as I said before, to buy areas like Brandenburg, for instance, or as I didn't say, to negotiate with Saxony to get parts of Meissen, I think. This would be a very crucial step, and also some crucial ideas that would be passed to the successors, and the successors, they would then try to use these tactics, but also in other moments. During the Reformation Wars, which still would happen in one way or another, because there was a certain momentum where the church would just get some problems, I could imagine that it would not really become an international affair as it was in OGL, and that the emperor would somehow be able to mediate between everyone. Although losing some, if not all, of his reputation with the Pope, as he would, for practical reasons, allow some of the dukes to change their confession from Catholicism to Protestantism. But if the dynasty of Luxembourg takes a different approach, saying, well, look, we had the Reformatio Sigismundi, where it was stated that the priests, they should be able to marry, and then you have someone like Martin Luther, who also had some points that were very intriguing. I could imagine that in one way or another, Martin Luther even might end up becoming a pope in this ATL. So, of course, he would not just become pope like this. So the Luxembourgish dynasty would also ask him certain favors. And I think one of these favors might be that Martin Luther would have to declare the title of emperor as a title that would be passed on from father to son, or maybe even to daughter, but well, that's already a very different discussion. In more peaceful times and after the New World would be discovered, Luxembourg and England, as well as Portugal, would have a good alliance at first, and instead of the Dutch, who wouldn't exist as a country in this timeline, it would be the Luxembourgish who would colonize some parts of the world. They would get some islands of the Caribbean, no lands in South America, as they were fairly good with the Portuguese and the English, and some lands in Africa and parts in Southeast Asia, ignoring Eastern European policies as long as it wouldn't affect them, because it would mainly be something that they would automatically give to the Hungarians, and they would be respected as they were also still part of the House of Luxembourg. Parts of Italy would eventually be lost, because even though the trade that came from Venice or Genoa was very beneficial, at one point they would just not be able to hold everything to it, and maybe with the colonies that they would discover and also populate, it would probably be more beneficial for Luxembourg overall to get trade from these colonies, get the goods of these colonies, than to send soldiers and to fight with the Italians, and then again after 20 years fight again and then again. So it would just be more beneficial to, go and conquer tribes or people that are not really as united as in Europe, and just unfortunately dominate them thanks to the better technology that they had. The Ottomans would destroy the Hungarians, and the Hungarians would slowly find themselves to be ruled by Bavarians or by Austrians, or maybe a mix between those two. So we could even say by the South Germans, for instance. Poland at the end would still be divided due to their bad political system, and Luxembourg could perhaps see the Russians as a very good partner, or maybe at some moment they would, when they see that the Russians become too strong, they would rather protect some parts of Poland to keep still some kind of room between those two growing empires. Industrialization would take place in parts of Wallonia and Luxembourg proper, thanks to coal and the minute stone. With their established trade routes and British contacts, because the Brits are still very good allies, Luxembourg would become the powerhouse in continental Europe. And they could decisively beat the French in an alternate war during the 1800s, 1850s, and at the same time Bohemia and other parts of, like Silesia for instance, they would rebel, as well as Eastern German parts, because they would not feel very integrated in this empire and also not see themselves as Luxembourgish. And in this ATL, being Luxembourgish is something very, very different than in OTL. So probably a Dutch person, and then also someone from the Alsace, and maybe someone from Rheinland-Pfalz, they would all consider themselves somehow to be Luxembourgish, but the Bavarian-Hungarian Empire would be the strongest adversary to Luxembourg, and even be able to occupy parts of it later on, but not for a very long time. In an alternate World War I, a coalition of France, Bavaria, Hungary, and other minor powers would fight the Luxembourgish Empire. And due to the fact that Luxembourg was in an unofficial competition with the UK, because the industrialization and also the colonies and so on, they made them far too strong for the British, and they were afraid that Luxembourg would just expand and just take over everything. The UK would abstain from this war but not participate in it. So they would rather like to see every power in Europe to destroy each other, attack each other, and then later on maybe take advantage here and there without being involved in this war. And as for Russia, Russia could intervene, but I think they would ultimately fail to do anything, as the problems that were very typical and classic to Russia itself, they would still be an issue in this timeline, as they would not really be addressed only by a change of, having Luxembourg as an empire. And as for the Ottomans, well, they would overextend, and, they would also fail. And the result would be that France would take back most of the French-speaking parts that Luxembourg owned. Poland becomes independent and even reconquer some parts, and Bavaria, Hungary, even though they were against the Luxembourgish Empire, they would still explode eventually at the end, because they would also have similar problems as the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And in an alternate World War II, Luxembourg could come victorious, having an alliance with Spain and this new Italy, taking out France while fending off Bavaria, who would be much smaller, accepting Bohemia's independence, because at the end Perhaps they would not like to destroy it just for the fact that they ruled over it, so they would just accept it, but also pressure Bohemia into giving up certain rights, like maybe some economic rights or foreign policies and stuff like this. And they would also take advantage of Poland's internal problems, because Poland, well, with Germans and with Balts, with Ukrainians, Belarusians, they would have a lot of problems. So the Luxembourg Empire, they could easily just, take advantage of it. At the end, when Luxembourg would be able to control most of continental Europe and still keep colonies, there would be a Cold War between Luxembourg and the UK. And who would win this Cold War, and who would be the first to the moon or to other planets? Would it be a British person, or would it maybe be a Luxembourgish person? That's the ASB scenario. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Althistory.